Hey there. Welcome to another deep dive with us.
It's great to be here.
So today we're going to be taking a deep dive into the Great Mental Models, Volume 3, which focuses on systems and mathematics.
A fascinating read. It really is like a cheat sheet for understanding how the world works, by using mental models to see the hidden patterns and connections.
Right, and the book covers a lot of ground. We have feedback loops, equilibrium, bottlenecks, scale, margins of safety, churn,
Algorithms, distributions, compounding, network effects, sampling, randomness.
Yeah, so we've got our work cut out for us. But I think it'll be a really insightful journey. I mean, just thinking about feedback loops alone got me thinking about how these loops are constantly shaping our lives.
Yeah.
Often in ways we don't realize.
Oh, absolutely. They're everywhere you look, really. Even something as simple as setting your thermostat is a basic example of a feedback loop in action.
Oh, right. You set the temperature and the system kicks in to maintain that equilibrium. Kind of like the book takes it further, right? It shows how these loops play out in social situations.
Yeah, for sure. It mentions Adam Smith's idea of the impartial spectator.
Oh, right. That inner voice that we all have that judges our actions based on how we think others would perceive them.
Yeah. And it's really fascinating how this social feedback loop influences our behavior, sometimes even more than formal rules or laws. I mean, think about it. You're more likely to hold the door open for someone if you think other people are watching.
Yeah. Like we're all on a stage. But on a more serious note, I think the book highlights how understanding these feedback loops can help us make better decisions, especially when we're dealing with more complex systems like legal systems or even international relations.
Exactly. And the book gives a really compelling example with paying ransoms to kidnappers.
Oh, right. I remember that. It creates that harmful reinforcing feedback loop. Because by rewarding the behavior, you actually incentivize more kidnappings, which seems counterintuitive at first.
It does, but breaking that loop requires a different approach, one that focuses on deterrence and maybe alternative solutions.
So it's a reminder to kind of think beyond just the immediate situation and to consider the long-term effects of our choices.
Right. Now, another key concept related to systems is equilibrium. And you can think of equilibrium as that state of balance where a system's variables remain within a desired range.
Okay, yeah, I can see that. And the book uses the analogy of a family household, which I think is pretty relatable. Keeping a household running smoothly definitely requires a delicate balance. You've got chores, finances, everybody's emotions. It's like juggling a dozen balls at once.
Exactly. And just like a family needs to adjust to changes, so do larger systems. I mean, take the human body, for instance. It has incredible mechanisms in place to maintain a stable internal environment.
Right, things like temperature regulation or blood sugar control.
Exactly. This ability to maintain equilibrium, even when faced with external changes, is absolutely crucial for survival.
It really is. So, but what happens when those external changes are just too dramatic or unexpected? Can systems break down?
Yeah, and the book addresses this using the example of Biosphere 2.
Oh, I remember hearing about Biosphere 2. It was an experiment to create like a completely closed, self-sustaining ecosystem, almost like a mini Earth under a glass dome.
Yeah, a really ambitious project. And while it was an incredible feat of engineering and scientific ambition, ultimately the experiment really revealed just how complex natural systems are, especially how interconnected they are.
Because they couldn't fully replicate those intricate feedback loops of the Earth, right?
Right. Things started to go wrong, oxygen levels dropped, crops failed, and even the social dynamics between the people living inside became strained.
Wow. So even with all of that planning and technology, they couldn't create a truly sustainable system. And what does that tell us about the challenges of managing our own planet's ecosystem?
It's definitely a humbling reminder. We still don't fully understand all the intricacies of natural systems, and that there's this very delicate balance at play. Even small changes can have those cascading effects, that are hard to predict or control.
Absolutely. Okay, well, speaking of interconnectedness, the book also talks about bottlenecks, those points in a system where things get stuck or slow down. And I have to admit, just hearing the word bottleneck makes me think of traffic.
Yeah, traffic jams are a perfect example, but really, bottlenecks can occur in any system, production lines, a communication network, even in our own decision-making processes. But the book actually argues that these bottlenecks aren't always a bad thing.
Really? How can a bottleneck be a good thing?
Well, sometimes constraints can force us to be more creative. The book uses the example of the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway.
Ah, yeah. A massive undertaking with tons of challenges.
It was, and bottlenecks in things like labor, resources, and logistics really forced engineers to come up with ingenious solutions that pushed the boundaries of what was thought possible at the time.
So it's kind of like that saying, necessity is the mother of invention. You hit a roadblock, you're forced to find a detour, and sometimes that detour leads to an unexpected breakthrough.
Right. But the book also cautions that addressing these bottlenecks without considering the broader system can actually create new problems elsewhere. Like, imagine trying to solve a labor shortage by bringing in a ton of workers.
Right.
But then you might end up straining things like food supplies or housing.
Right. It's like playing a game of whack-a-mole with system issues.
Exactly. You solve one problem and then another one just pops up somewhere else.
So how do we avoid creating more problems than we solve?
Well, the key is to move beyond just reacting to problems as they arise and to really adopt a more proactive systems thinking approach. By understanding how different parts of a system are interconnected, we can anticipate potential bottlenecks and maybe come up with solutions that address the root causes rather than just the symptoms.
It's about seeing the forest for the trees, as they say. Okay, so shifting gears a bit, let's talk about scale. The book emphasizes how systems can behave differently at different scales. It's like that old saying, what works in a test tube doesn't always work in the real world.
Exactly. Scaling up doesn't always mean things are going to get better. In fact, sometimes it introduces a whole new set of complexities. Think about a small startup, for example.
Right.
What might have worked perfectly fine when they just had a handful of employees can completely fall apart as they grow to hundreds or thousands of employees.
Like trying to manage a small family gathering versus organizing a massive music festival.
Exactly. The logistics and the dynamics change completely. So the book suggests that we need to be very mindful of the unique challenges and opportunities that arise at different scales.
And one example that really resonated with me was the Japanese company Kongo Gumi,
Oh, fascinating example.
a construction company specializing in Buddhist temples. They operated for over 1,400 years.
Yeah. Staying relatively small, focusing on quality and craftsmanship.
Yeah.
And they managed to weather just countless societal and economic shifts.
Which really shows the power of resilience and having a long-term vision.
It does. And what's really fascinating about Kongo Gumi is that they illustrate the importance of values and having a very clear purpose. I mean, their focus on tradition, on craftsmanship, on community, those all contributed to their longevity and success.
Yeah. And it's not just about maximizing profits or growth. It's about building something that can endure over time, and that often requires a deeper sense of purpose and values.
Okay, well, for a very different perspective on scale, the book also looks at the evolution of artificial lighting.
Ooh, that's a good one.
It's amazing to think how something as basic as light has shaped human activity, our social structures, even our relationship with time.
Think about the transition from like simple oil lamps to gaslight. Suddenly factories could operate around the clock, or to a massive shift in production and work schedules.
Yeah. And then electric lighting came along, transforming cities and homes, literally illuminating the night.
It's incredible, isn't it? How these seemingly simple advancements in technology can have such profound effects on a whole system. Absolutely. It makes you wonder what other hidden systems are shaping our lives in ways we haven't even considered.
Well, that's the beauty of mental models. They help us see the world with fresh eyes. Speaking of hidden connections, let's talk about another key concept: margin of safety. Think of it like building in a buffer to account for unexpected events or errors.
Okay, so that makes sense. It's like having a backup plan. Or maybe like wearing a helmet when you go rock climbing. You might not need it, but you're sure glad you have it if things go wrong.
Exactly. And the book uses the analogy of a bridge. Engineers don't just calculate the minimum strength needed to support the weight of traffic. They add in a margin of safety to account for unforeseen stresses, potential material weaknesses, or even just wear and tear over time.
So it's about building in a cushion, a little extra room for error, to make the system more resilient. And there are some great examples in the book, like astronaut training.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
Astronauts train for every imaginable scenario because the cost of failure in space is just, well, astronomical.
Exactly. And this concept isn't limited to just physical structures. It applies to organizations, financial planning, even our personal decision-making. Like, think about having multiple routes to get to work.
Oh, right. If one route is blocked, you've got alternatives.
Exactly. Having options and backup plans can reduce stress and make you more adaptable to those unexpected events.
And I like how the book also talks about how learning and proactive planning contribute to these personal margins of safety. The more knowledge and skills we acquire, the more prepared we are to handle whatever life throws our way.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power, but it's also a safety net. It expands our ability to respond effectively to a wider range of situations. Now, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about a concept that might sound a little unsettling at first. Churn.
Okay, churn. Now that sounds like something you do with butter, but I'm guessing it has a slightly different meaning in the context of systems, right?
You got it. In systems thinking, churn refers to turnover, or the rate at which things, whether that's customers or employees or even ideas, enter and exit a system. Now, high churn can be a real problem, especially for businesses. If you're constantly losing customers or employees, it's going to be costly and disruptive.
Yeah, it's like a leaky bucket. You're constantly having to refill it, but you never quite reach the top.
Yeah.
But you mentioned churn isn't always a bad thing.
Right. Sometimes a certain amount of churn is necessary to maintain a system's health and to prevent stagnation. It brings in fresh perspectives, new talent, innovative ideas. The book uses a fascinating example with the Bourbaki group, which was a collective of mathematicians who actually had a system of membership churn in place.
Oh, interesting.
To ensure that there was a constant influx of new ideas, to keep the group intellectually vibrant.
It's kind of like refreshing the soil in a garden.
Exactly. You need to add new nutrients and compost to keep those plants healthy and thriving. Too much churn can disrupt the ecosystem, but too little can lead to stagnation. It's about finding that sweet spot where the system benefits from this new input without losing its core identity.
Exactly. And now let's transition to the fascinating realm of mathematics, where we'll explore how these seemingly abstract concepts can have really surprising real-world applications.
Okay, sounds good.
First up, algorithms.
Oh, algorithms, those mysterious lines of code that power our digital world. But I have a feeling that the book takes maybe a slightly broader view of algorithms, right?
Absolutely. The book reminds us that algorithms aren't just for computers. I mean, they're everywhere. A recipe is an algorithm. Instructions to assemble furniture, algorithm. Even the way we make decisions can be seen as an algorithm, a step-by-step process for achieving a desired outcome.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. It's about breaking down a complex task into manageable steps and applying a consistent set of rules to achieve a specific result. But the book delves into some pretty unexpected applications of algorithms, right? They do. For example, pirate societies.
Pirates? Organized? That's not the image that comes to mind. I always picture them as more free-spirited and chaotic.
Well, it turns out that they actually had very strict codes of conduct, systems for dividing treasure, and even democratic processes for electing their captains.
Wait, so pirates had elections? That's wild. So how do algorithms fit into all of this?
Well, the book tells the story of Qing Shi, a female pirate.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, she commanded this vast fleet in the early 1800s, and her success was largely attributed to her implementation of a very detailed code of conduct. It was essentially an algorithm for maintaining order and discipline among her crew, a set of rules that made sure everybody knew their role and the consequences for breaking those rules.
It's like a pirate constitution. It's amazing to think that even in such a seemingly chaotic and dangerous world, that clear rules and systems can actually create this surprising level of effectiveness.
Right. And beyond rules and order, the book also highlights how the development of algorithms has led to incredible breakthroughs in science and medicine.
Now that's a connection I wouldn't have expected. How do algorithms play a role in scientific discoveries?
Well, they discuss the discovery of sulfa drugs, the first antibiotics that were effective against bacterial infections. And the process of finding these drugs involved this very systematic, algorithmic approach to testing thousands of chemical compounds until they finally found one that worked.
So it's like having a recipe for scientific discovery. You follow the steps, test the ingredients, and hopefully you end up with a breakthrough.
Precisely. It really is a testament to the power of a systematic process, even when you're dealing with a lot of uncertainty and complex variables. So whether you're baking a cake, running a pirate ship, or searching for life-saving medicines, algorithms can provide this framework for achieving those desired outcomes. It's all about breaking those complex tasks into manageable steps and applying a consistent set of rules to navigate through complexity.
Okay, algorithms everywhere really is a different way of looking at the world. Speaking of new ways of looking at things, let's dive into another key concept in mathematics, distributions.
Ah, yes. Distributions help us understand how data points are spread out, and the book focuses on two key types: normal distribution and power law distribution. So imagine you're plotting the heights of everyone in a large group.
Okay, yeah.
Most people are going to cluster around the average height with fewer people at the extremes, right?
Yeah.
very tall or very short. That's your normal distribution, often represented by that bell curve.
Okay. So it's like a visual representation of how common certain characteristics are within a population.
Yeah.
Most people fall somewhere in the middle, and then you have those outliers, those who are exceptionally tall or short.
Exactly. And this type of distribution is really common. You see it a lot in natural phenomena, things like height, weight, even IQ scores. But then there's another type of distribution that behaves very differently, the power law distribution.
Okay. So how is a power law distribution different?
Well, power law distributions are characterized by these extreme outliers, and those outliers have a disproportionate impact on the overall distribution. Think about wealth distribution, for example. While most people fall within a certain income range, you have a tiny percentage who hold a massive amount of the wealth.
It's like the Pareto principle, that 80-20 rule. A small percentage of factors often account for a large percentage of the outcomes. But why is it so important to understand which distribution applies to a given situation?
Because it can dramatically affect our predictions and our decisions.
Yeah.
You see, normal distributions are great for predicting average outcomes,
Uh-huh.
but they can be very misleading when you're dealing with extreme events or those outliers, which are much more common in power law scenarios. The book gives the example of financial markets. Extreme events like market crashes can't really be predicted accurately if you're using normal distribution models.
So it's kind of like using the wrong map to navigate a city. You might get somewhere eventually, but you're likely to get lost along the way.
Exactly. It's crucial to understand the underlying patterns and to use the right tools for the job.
Okay, well, speaking of powerful tools, let's dive into a mental model that's all about slow and steady progress. Compounding.
Oh, compounding. Compounding is one of the most powerful forces, really. It's like that snowball rolling downhill, gathering more snow as it goes, growing exponentially larger over time.
Okay.
And the book emphasizes how this principle applies to knowledge, relationships, and finances.
I'm intrigued. Give me some examples of how compounding works in those areas.
Sure. So, with knowledge, the more you learn, the easier it becomes to learn new things. Your existing knowledge base sort of creates this foundation upon which you can connect new information more easily.
So it's like building a mental scaffolding. Each new piece of knowledge adds strength and stability to that overall structure.
Exactly. And then with relationships, well, the more you invest in your relationships, the stronger and more valuable those relationships become. Trust deepens, you create bonds through shared experiences. That support network you build can really help you weather life's inevitable challenges.
Like nurturing a garden. The more time and care you invest, the more beautiful and bountiful it becomes.
And of course, with finances, compounding is like that magic ingredient that turns small, consistent investments into significant wealth over time. It's the power of earning interest on your interest. It's really how fortunes are built.
It's like planting a seed and watching it grow into this mighty tree. You might not see dramatic results right away, but with patience and consistent nurturing, the growth can be astonishing.
It really can. But the book points out that our brains often struggle to really grasp the power of compounding, especially in the early stages when progress might seem slow.
Right, because we tend to think linearly, not exponentially.
Exactly. So the key is to embrace that long-term perspective, to trust in the power of that consistent effort over time.
It's a reminder that those small actions, repeated consistently, can lead to really remarkable results. It's not about finding a magic bullet. It's about embracing the power of the long game.
It is. Now, speaking of long-term growth and success, let's talk about network effects, a concept that explains how many successful products and services grow so rapidly.
Okay, network effects. Tell me more.
So network effects happen when the value of a product or service actually increases as more people use it. Think about telephones. A phone is useless if you're the only one who owns one, right? But its value grows exponentially as more people join that network.
It's like a party. The more people who show up, the more fun it becomes.
Yeah.
But as you mentioned earlier, getting those network effects started can be a challenge, like trying to get that party going when you're the only one on the dance floor.
Exactly. There's often an initial hurdle to overcome before that reinforcing feedback loop really kicks in. But once it does, that growth can be incredibly fast. The book uses examples like Facebook and ride-sharing apps that started small but quickly gained momentum.
Like a snowball effect. But instead of snow, it's users and value that are accumulating. And these network effects aren't just limited to technology. They apply to everything from cities attracting talented workers to the stability of gold as a store of value.
They really do. It's a powerful concept to understand, especially for understanding how certain systems or products can achieve that rapid, widespread adoption. It's a key driver of innovation and growth across many industries.
Now, before we wrap up this first part of our deep dive, I want to touch on a key concept that underpins a lot of the models that we've talked about so far. Sampling.
Oh, yes, sampling.
Sampling is about taking a representative subset of a larger population to draw conclusions about the whole. And as the book points out, the accuracy of our conclusions really hinges on the quality of our sample.
It does.
If the sample is too small or it's biased, the results can be skewed, potentially leading to some faulty decisions.
Right. And they use a great example with medical research. Small or unrepresentative samples can lead to some very misleading conclusions about the effectiveness of a drug or treatment, for example. It's a good reminder to be really critical of data and to consider the source and the methodology before making any important decisions based on it.
So it's not just about gathering data, it's about gathering the right data.
Really?
Okay, so before we move on to part 2 of our deep dive, let's touch on one final concept that can be a bit challenging, but ultimately helps us understand the role of chance in our lives. Randomness.
Randomness. This one can really make you question your perception of the world.
I know, right?
Yeah.
It's like we want to believe that we have more control than we actually do.
Yeah.
So our brains try to kind of impose order on even those chaotic situations.
Right. And that tendency can lead to all sorts of misjudgments and biases. We see patterns where none exist, overestimate our ability to predict outcomes, and underestimate the influence of factors outside of our control.
So how do we reconcile this desire for order with the reality of randomness?
The book actually suggests that embracing randomness rather than resisting it can actually be very liberating.
Okay.
It allows us to let go of the need to have to explain everything and to just accept that some things are simply beyond our control.
It's kind of like acknowledging that life is a game of chance. But that doesn't mean we can't play the game strategically.
Exactly.
We can still make informed decisions, develop skills, work towards our goals,
Yeah.
but with the understanding that, hey, sometimes those dice just aren't going to roll in our favor.
Right. It's about finding that balance, that sweet spot between taking those calculated risks, but accepting the inherent uncertainty of life. And that brings us to the end of part 1 of our deep dive into The Great Mental Models, Volume 3.
Wow. We've covered a lot of ground already. I feel like I'm starting to see the world with new eyes, noticing all of these hidden connections that were always there, but I just couldn't see them before.
That's the power of these mental models. They give us these new frameworks for understanding and navigating the world around us. And we've only just begun.
Welcome back to our deep dive into The Great Mental Models, Volume 3.
It's great to be back.
Last time we were talking about randomness and how it can be so hard to wrap our heads around the fact that we don't always have as much control as we'd like to think we do.
Yeah. Randomness can really make you question everything.
Right. But building on this idea of randomness, the book introduces this fascinating concept called regression to the mean.
Okay, regression to the mean. So that sounds a bit intimidating. Does that mean that we're all just destined to be average? Like no matter how hard we try, will we always end up back where we started?
Not necessarily. It's more about understanding that things tend to even out over time. Extreme events, whether they're really good or really bad, are usually followed by results that are closer to the average.
Yeah.
Think about a basketball player who has this amazing game, scores way above their usual average.
Okay. Well, in the next game, they're probably going to score closer to their typical performance.
So what goes up must come down, but in a statistical sense.
Exactly. And this applies to all sorts of things, financial markets, personal performance. It's a good tool for keeping our expectations in check.
Like a reality check for our brains when they get a little too optimistic, or pessimistic for that matter.
Exactly. Now, shifting gears a bit, the book brings up this concept of multiplying by zero.
Multiplying by zero. Okay, that sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Well, in a way it is. This mental model emphasizes how a single critical flaw or weakness can completely negate all of your other efforts, no matter how impressive they are. It's like, in a complex equation, if you multiply it by zero, the entire result just becomes zero.
Right. It's like baking a cake and forgetting to add the baking powder.
Exactly. All those other ingredients, all that effort, it all goes to waste. And this concept plays out in so many real-world systems. The book uses the example of crop diversity.
Oh,
If a society relies too heavily on a single crop, and then there's a disease or a pest outbreak, Well, it could wipe out their entire food supply.
Putting all your eggs in one basket and then dropping the basket.
Exactly. Not a good strategy. The book argues that diversity is essential for resilience, whether we're talking about crop varieties, investment portfolios, or even skill sets in individuals.
So it's a reminder not to put all your faith in a single solution, no matter how promising it seems. Diversification is key. Having backup options so that if one thing fails, the whole system doesn't just crumble.
Now let's switch gears again and talk about equivalence.
Equivalence. Does that mean all paths lead to the same destination?
Not exactly, but it does highlight that different paths can lead to the same outcome. We often have such a narrow view of success, believing that there's only one right way to achieve a goal.
Like assuming there's only one recipe for chocolate chip cookies, right?
Right. But anyone who bakes knows that there are countless variations that can lead to equally delicious cookies.
Okay, yeah, that's true. So it's kind of like reaching the summit of a mountain. There might be multiple trails that can get you there.
Exactly. So equivalence reminds us that there's rarely just one right answer, and that different approaches can be equally valid.
It's about embracing those different perspectives and learning from others who are maybe taking a different route to the same destination.
Okay, well, to help us grasp the scale of things, I think it's time to talk about orders of magnitude.
Ah, yes. Orders of magnitude. This is simply a way of comparing numbers that are vastly different in size. Each order of magnitude represents a 10-fold increase or decrease.
Okay.
So for example, 100 is 1 order of magnitude larger than 10, and 1,000 is 2 orders of magnitude larger than 10.
So it's like a zoom lens for numbers, helping us to see the differences in scale.
Exactly. The book highlights how orders of magnitude are used in things like the Richter scale for earthquakes or measuring the brightness of stars.
So it's like comparing an ant to an elephant.
Exactly. Both living creatures, but operating on completely different scales. Right. Totally different orders of magnitude. So understanding orders of magnitude can really help us make more informed decisions.
Absolutely. Imagine you're evaluating an investment opportunity. It's important to consider not just the potential returns, but also the scale of the investment. A 10% return on a $100 investment is vastly different from a 10% return on a $1 million investment.
It's all about perspective. All right, well, building on this idea of scale, the book introduces this model that explains how systems evolve and adapt over time, and that is surface area.
Surface area is all about how much interaction a system has with its environment.
Okay.
And that can influence its growth, stability, even its vulnerability.
Okay, I'm trying to visualize this. So is it kind of like thinking about a house? A larger house has more surface area exposed to the elements, so it's more susceptible to things like weather damage.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
But it also has more potential for windows and doors.
Right, more light, more ventilation.
Okay, I see that.
And this concept applies to all kinds of systems. Biological organisms, organizations, even nations. The book uses the example of guerrilla warfare. A smaller, more agile force can effectively challenge a much larger, more powerful army by minimizing its surface area and exploiting its vulnerabilities.
It's like the classic David and Goliath story, but with a strategic, surface area-focused approach.
Exactly. And thinking about surface area can help us make sense of things like communication and information flow. They use the example of maps.
Okay, maps. I can see that.
Maps are basically simplified representations of a larger territory, right?
Right, like the London Underground map.
Right.
It doesn't show you the actual distances between stations.
Yeah.
But it's really useful for navigating that system.
Exactly. By reducing the surface area of information, they make it much easier to understand and to navigate complex systems. But the book reminds us to be cautious about oversimplification. Reducing the surface area too much means you risk losing crucial information.
It's like trying to cram an entire encyclopedia into a single tweet. You might get the basic idea, but you're going to miss all of the details and nuances.
Exactly. Now let's shift our attention to a model that helps us understand how systems can get stuck in those suboptimal states. Local and global maxima.
Local and global maxima. Another mountain analogy coming on.
You got it. Imagine you're hiking in a mountainous region. You might reach a peak and think it's the highest point around. But as you explore further, you might discover an even taller mountain in the distance. That first peak was a local maximum, the highest point in that immediate area, but not the highest point overall. That would be the global maximum.
Okay, so it's like thinking you found the perfect chocolate chip cookie recipe, but then you come across an even more amazing recipe later on.
Exactly. The challenge is to recognize when we're stuck in a local maximum and have the courage to explore new possibilities, even if it means taking risks.
To push beyond those initial peaks and seek out those towering global maxima.
Exactly. And now, to understand system dynamics a bit more, let's explore the concept of global and local minima.
Okay, global and local minima. So if maxima are like mountain peaks, are minima like the bottom of the ocean?
That's a great way to think about it. Just as we might strive to reach a global maximum in some situations, in other situations we might want to find the global minimum. This is about finding the most efficient or cost-effective solution.
Okay, yeah. Like if you're trying to optimize a process, right? Finding ways to minimize waste or streamline things.
Exactly. The book uses examples like the formation of riverbeds or how proteins fold. It's about finding those stable, low-energy states.
So it's kind of like nature's always seeking out the most efficient solutions, minimizing effort and energy wherever possible. Sometimes the best solution isn't the flashiest one, it's the one that simply works the best.
Now let's talk about a concept that explains the success of bands like Queen and the Beatles, the idea of iterating through local maxima.
Okay, I'm interested to hear more about this one. How does that relate to the success of those iconic bands?
Well, they didn't achieve that massive success overnight. They went through lots of changes. They formed, disbanded, reformed, experimented with different lineups, musical styles, and approaches. And each band they formed before hitting it big can be seen as a local maximum.
So it's like each step along the way was a learning experience, and ultimately it contributed to their final breakthrough.
Right. They didn't let those failures stop them. They kept iterating, refining their approach, and they finally reached that global maximum, those iconic lineups and styles that we all know and love.
It's a great reminder that success often involved a lot of trial and error. It's about having that persistence, that willingness to keep going until you get it right.
Exactly. Now let's talk about increasing or decreasing surface area.
Okay, I remember we talked about surface area earlier, but how can we actually manipulate it to our advantage?
Well, the book explains that increasing your surface area can actually promote growth and innovation. For example, if you're trying to learn a new skill, exposing yourself to a wider range of information and experiences can really accelerate that process.
It's like opening up more doors and windows, letting in all that light and air and new possibilities.
Right. Businesses do this too by expanding into new markets, developing new products, forming partnerships. But it's important to remember that increasing surface area also increases vulnerability.
It's like having a bigger target on your back, right?
Yeah.
The more exposed you are, the easier it is for something to go wrong.
Exactly. So it's all about finding that balance, exposure versus protection.
Okay, that makes sense.
Now, let's talk about communicating effectively when you can't tell the whole truth.
Okay. That sounds like it could be tricky. How do you communicate complex information without oversimplifying things or misleading people?
Well, think about maps again. Maps are inherently simplified, right? They have to leave out certain details.
Right, to focus on the key information.
Exactly. And it's the same when you're trying to explain something complex. You have to choose the most important points and sometimes leave out those finer details.
It's like summarizing a book. You can't include everything.
Right. And the key is to be transparent about the limitations. Honest maps, acknowledge their limitations, and provide some context to help people interpret that information accurately.
So it's like saying, here's a map to guide you, but remember there might be some detours or obstacles along the way.
Exactly. And this applies to all kinds of communication. Scientific reports, news articles, even just conversations. It's about finding that balance between being clear and being accurate.
Being honest, both with yourself and with others. Okay, I like that.
Now let's explore the difference between global and local optimization.
Okay, so how can we apply that concept to our own lives to make better decisions and solve problems?
Well, imagine a sculptor working on a statue. They might start with the overall shape and proportions before adding those finer details.
Okay, so it's like having a blueprint or a roadmap to guide the creative process.
Exactly. And that principle is important in all sorts of areas. In business, it's about having a clear vision and strategy before you get lost in the day-to-day. In personal development, it's about setting big goals and values to help guide your decisions.
Avoiding getting lost in the weeds, keeping the big picture in mind.
Exactly. Now, building on that idea, let's talk about irreducibility.
Irreducibility.
That sounds deep.
It is. It's the idea that some things just can't be simplified or reduced beyond a certain point without losing their essence or their functionality. Kind of like when you try to compress a file too much.
Oh, right. You might save space, but you risk damaging the file.
Exactly. The book points out that this concept applies to physical objects, communication systems. You can streamline a process, you can summarize an idea, but there's a point where you just can't simplify any further.
Like finding that sweet spot between simplicity and complexity, where further reduction just wouldn't work. Right, they give the example of typography. Each letter has these essential elements that must be preserved in order for it to be recognizable. You can stylize fonts, but you can only simplify them so much before they become illegible.
Like those CAPI TCHA tests online where you had to decipher those distorted letters.
Yes, they're playing with that idea of irreducibility. So it's a reminder to be careful about simplifying things too much. It can have unintended consequences.
Okay, that makes sense. So now let's move on to the law of diminishing returns. This is one that I've heard of, but I'm curious to hear how the book explains it.
The law of diminishing returns basically states that as you increase your effort or investment in something, the marginal benefits will eventually start to decrease.
Okay, so does that mean we're all just doomed to hit a wall eventually?
Not necessarily. It means we need to be smart about how we use our time and energy. Think about studying for an exam. Those first few hours of studying can be really productive, but at a certain point, you're not really absorbing as much new information. You might be better off taking a break, letting your brain rest, and then coming back to it later.
Like squeezing a lemon. You can only get so much juice out of it, no matter how hard you squeeze.
Exactly. This principle applies to a lot of things. Exercise, business investments, even learning new skills. There's always that point of diminishing returns.
So it's about working smarter, not just harder.
Exactly. Now for our last concept in this part of our deep dive, hyperbolic discounting.
Hyperbolic discounting. That sounds pretty intense. What is that all about?
It's all about time and how we make decisions. It basically explains our tendency to favor immediate gratification over those long-term rewards, even when the long-term rewards might be objectively more valuable.
It's like choosing cake over a salad, even though you know the salad is better for you.
Exactly. Our brains are wired to focus on survival in the moment. That immediate gratification was more important for survival in our evolutionary past. And so even though we're not facing those same immediate threats today, our brains still have that tendency to discount those future rewards.
So it's like our brains are still stuck in the Stone Age, prioritizing those short-term impulses even when it's not really the best thing for us in the long run.
Right. But the book offers some strategies for overcoming this. One of them is pre-commitment, where we make decisions in advance that kind of bind our future selves to a certain course of action, like setting up automatic savings contributions or even scheduling those doctor's appointments in advance.
It's like tricking your present self into making choices that are good for your future self.
Exactly. It's about being strategic, setting yourself up for success. And that brings us to the end of part 2 of our deep dive.
Welcome back for the final part of our deep dive into The Great Mental Models, Volume 3.
It's great to be here.
We've been exploring all these fascinating mental models.
Yes.
From feedback loops to hyperbolic discounting.
It's been quite the journey.
But now I think it's time to talk about actually applying these models in our lives.
Absolutely. I mean, it's great to understand these models, but their true value comes when we use them as tools,
Right. Not just acquiring the knowledge, but actually putting it into practice.
Exactly. I mean, you don't just want to memorize a bunch of definitions. You want to internalize these models. So how do you do that? The book suggests starting by identifying the specific challenges or problems that you're facing. Once you have a clear understanding of the situation, you can then choose the most relevant mental models to help analyze the problem, maybe generate some potential solutions, make more informed decisions.
So it's kind of like a doctor diagnosing a patient.
Yeah.
Right? They gather information about symptoms, they consider all the possible diagnoses, and then they prescribe a treatment based on that understanding.
Exactly. And just like a doctor has a variety of tools and treatment options, our mental model toolkit should also be diverse and adaptable.
So it's not about finding this one-size-fits-all solution, but developing a more flexible approach to problem solving.
Right. You want to be able to assess the situation, identify the key factors, and then select the mental models that will give you a fresh perspective. And to illustrate how these models can be applied in a practical way, the book shares the story of Hans Scharf.
Hans Scharf. Who's that?
He was a German interrogator during World War II.
A World War II interrogator. Okay, I'm listening.
So Scharf was remarkably successful. He extracted information from captured Allied pilots. But here's the thing. Unlike a lot of interrogators at that time, he didn't use torture or coercion. He was known for his more humane approach, and yet he was incredibly effective.
So I'm guessing he had some pretty clever psychological techniques.
He did, and his approach was really rooted in an understanding of human psychology and systems thinking. He treated his prisoners with respect, he built rapport, used very subtle techniques to nudge them toward revealing information voluntarily.
So it's like the complete opposite of those stereotypical movie scenes.
Yeah.
The harsh lights, the bad cop, good cop routine.
Exactly. Sharf understood that building a connection was far more effective than trying to break someone down. He understood that people are complex. He recognized that they're driven by various motives, fears, and desires. And he used his knowledge of human behavior to create a system that encouraged cooperation.
It's a reminder that sometimes the most effective approach isn't the most forceful one, but the one that really understands human nature.
Right. Now, the book talks about this idea of a mental model lattice work.
A mental model lattice work.
Yeah, basically it's about connecting and integrating different mental models so you're not just looking at them in isolation, you're seeing the relationships between them.
So you're kind of weaving them together into this tapestry that gives you this richer, more nuanced understanding of the world.
Exactly. And as you acquire more mental models and connect them with what you already know, your lattice work becomes more intricate, more powerful. And that allows you to start to see those patterns, make those connections, have those aha moments that you wouldn't have had otherwise.
It's like upgrading from a basic map to a really sophisticated GPS system.
Exactly. And this is a lifelong journey, it's an ongoing process of learning, connecting, refining.
So it's not about mastering all the models. It's about constantly seeking out new knowledge and expanding your understanding.
Absolutely. It's about being curious and adaptable. As your lattice work grows, you become better equipped to handle the complexities of life. You make better decisions, you solve problems more effectively.
It's like working at your mental muscles. The more you use them, the stronger they become.
That's a great way to put it. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into The Great Mental Models, Volume 3. Remember, these mental models are tools, and just like any tool, they're most effective when used skillfully. So go out there, explore the world, and see what you can do with your new understanding.
It's been a fascinating exploration. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep those mental gears turning.